Welcome. It's Monday at 1 o'clock. Time for the Deal Doctor live presentation. Thanks for joining, and I hope that you all get something out of today's session. It'll be about 20 minutes to a half an hour, depending upon how quickly I'm able to get through the material for you today. Eric and I, Kim and Paul, everyone who is fielding questions from agents continues to get questions that are related to agency and agency law, agency representation, what it means, and so on. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today, try to get more clarity, because obviously there's still a lack of clarity out there. But before I do that, I want to talk about a standard of practice that was added by the National Association of Realtors. It's Standard of Practice 10-5. This was language that was included into the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics as a result of their meeting in October, and ultimately they voted on it on November 13. And the recommendation was that it would go into effect immediately. And this is a standard of practice 10-5, and it applies to anyone who is a member of the National Association of Realtors, which I think most of you, if not all, are. It would be unusual that you wouldn't. So it says, Realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. I'll read that again slowly, if that wasn't slow enough. Realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Wow. We all kind of knew that. We all, in our practice of our business, are very careful about what we say. But what this standard of practice actually does is it expands that responsibility or that behavior, that control of behavior, to our personal lives. So if you get caught putting something on Facebook, for example, and it is a harassing speech. What is harassing speech? I'm not really sure. I guess it's going to be up to the National Association of Realtors to determine whether or not my speech that I post on Facebook is harassing, or if I am harassing you, is that impacted by this standard of practice or not? I don't know the answer. I think it's a very it's a very broad brush that they're painting with here, and I worry that ultimately the NAR is going to be the monitor of our public behavior. So I just encourage everybody, before you put something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, you look very carefully and you think very carefully about what it says. Something that could seem relatively innocent could be perceived as something that is against the standard of practice 10-5. What is hate speech? What is an epithet? Well, it depends on the person listening to it, but I think that it's fair to say that if it is intended to degrade someone, it's probably, you probably ought to avoid it. Handicap. What is it? What do you say about someone? I mean, I've seen posts and so on making references to people's mental capacity. Is that a violation? Well, according to standard practice at 10-5, the answer is yes. And you could be brought up on a grievance proceeding in the National Association of Realtors for violating that in your own personal life. What happens if you go to a cocktail party and you say something that is inappropriate? And you may think that it's just a joke, but somebody overhears you and reports that to your local board. This standard of practice could conceivably be used to file a grievance against you for your for something that you might say outside of your professional life. It's a really broad, as I said, very broad brush that they're painting with here. It's going to be interesting to find out whether or not this is going to be enforceable or at what level. But my purpose in mentioning it is be very careful out there, because this has gone into effect and you are going to be measured by this by the public. So, moving on. As I said, we have a lot of calls from agents who are still clearly uncertain about where the lines are drawn when it comes to agency, the law of agency, and what it means to be have fiduciary responsibility to our clients. So I'm going to try to walk through some of the basic tenets of agency. And one of the ways that I remember is the mnemonic device old car, an acronym that gives me a way to remember what we are responsible to do in large part for our clients if they are our clients under an agency contract or in an implied agency relationship, which is in and of itself a danger that I'm going to talk about a little bit more after this. So I'm going to start right with the beginning. Old car, obedience. Number one, we owe our clients obedience, and as long as it's not illegal. If they are telling us something that is illegal, none of the agency laws or fiduciary responsibility applies. They cannot tell us to break the law. For example, if they want us to discriminate against a potential group of buyers, that is not something that we have to be obedient to them for. In fact, quite the opposite. So, but let's say, for example, let's take the buyer who wants to write 30% under the list price, and the house has had 50 showings in the 24 hours it's been on the multiple listing. Now, you and I both know that 30% offer isn't going to be accepted. And so a lot of agents will say, no, I'm not going to waste my time writing that offer. Well, that's not your call. That falls under obedience. You're required to write that offer so long as you have an agency relationship with your client. Now, there are three options in my view. Number one is the one I used first. I'm going to try to persuade that client to understand that the market is not going to accept that offer, and let's try to get real and write something that they're going to accept. Sometimes it's a learning process. Sometimes they write 3, 4, 5, 6 offers before they finally realize that they can't lowball an offer. But that's a learning process, and it's your choice to go down that road. The option number 2 is that you write the offer, and as I said, maybe it's a succession of offers that get written and turned down where they finally go, oh, I guess we're going to have to write something at or close to full price or whatever it might be, at least at market price. So That's option number 2, is to actually obey them and do what they ask. The third option is to say to them, this agency thing, this, buyer agency thing, it's just not working here because obviously you don't have faith in my judgment when it comes to writing an offer. So I'm going to end our relationship and let you go somewhere else. But so long as you have that agency relationship with them, you owe them obedience. Another thing you owe them is loyalty. I can't tell you the number of times that I've gotten calls and agents have said to me that they have their client is crazy or something. So they are just out of control. Well, you can share that with me because it's not going to go anywhere. It's within our 5-star group, but be very, very, very careful about posting something like that on Facebook or Twitter or mentioning it to a friend saying, I've got the craziest clients. No, you owe them loyalty. That's part of your agency responsibilities. Another one is disclosure. This is a biggie. You owe your client disclosure of any information that you discover during the course of your client relationship with them. Now, keep in mind, for example, let's pretend that you had a listing contract with a client for a home at 123 Main Street. The listing ran out, and now you have a buyer under contract, under a buyer agency contract, and you show them 123 Main Street. And you know that 123 Main Street has been redecorated or had an inspection where something minor, not a material defect, caused the inspection to fall apart. You don't have the right to share information from that prior listing. That agency relationship and the confidentiality that comes with it of the prior listing continues on forever. You don't have the right to share that information with a new client who is looking at that particular property, for example. But you also don't have the right to share confidential information. Let's say, for example, you have a listing and there's a divorce involved. Do you have the right to tell a buyer or a buyer's agent that, hey, these people are motivated or they're going to be tough to deal with because there's a divorce involved? No, that's their confidential information. You don't have a right to tell anybody that unless you get it in writing from your client that you may share that information with someone. You may run into a situation where you have a listing and you know that the listing is at $200,000, but they'll take a good offer at $190,000. Do you have the right to share that information? Nope. Unless they put it in writing. Best way they can put it in writing is price reduction to that price. But you owe them confidentiality. You owe them disclosure of any information that you find along the way. That let's say, for example, you have that listing, a buyer walks in, and the buyer goes, wow, this is a great house. I love this house. I would pay $10,000 over the asking price, excuse me, for this house. Do you have a responsibility to share that with your listing client? Absolutely. But wait, what happens if you have a buyer's agency contract with that buyer? Now you're operating in dual agency. Have you disclosed to both parties that you are operating in dual agency? If you have a contract with a listing, contract with a buyer, and the buyer is looking at that property and seriously considering an offer, have you disclosed to both of them that you're acting in dual agency? Or have you said to the buyer, listen, here's the deal. I've had a prior relationship with the seller, and so I have to get in writing from you that I have disclosed to you, and you have agreed that I am going to work for the seller as it regards this particular transaction. Or have you gone back to both of them and said, listen, here's the deal. I have the listing contract, and I have a buyer under agency contract that wants to buy the house. It puts me in a position where I am a dual agent. Do I have your permission to move forward and write an offer on this property? Now, I know that you all know that there's supposed to be a listing contract and a buyer's agency contract, excuse me, in place before you can go into dual agency. And what happens a lot of times in reality is that you have a listing contract, you go into dual agency with a dual agency agreement, but you never actually get a buyer's agency contract signed. Guess what? It doesn't work that way, because with the buyer agency part of it, you're not actually an agent for them as per designated agency rules, and 5 Stars at designated agency office. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But another aspect is the accounting or accountability. This talks about the financial responsibility that we have to be a good steward for the money involved in a transaction. For example, the earnest money deposit. You have to be a good steward. You have to take good care of it. You can't throw it in the back seat of your car and hand it off to the bookkeeping department a week later. If you incur expenses for photography and so on and so forth, and you have an agreement with the seller prior to those expenditures, incurring those expenditures, if you have an agreement with the seller that if for any reason you terminate your contract, that the seller is going to reimburse you for those expenses, then you have to have that in writing. You have to be able to account for those dollars that you spent on their behalf. Sorry. Reasonable care and diligence. What is reasonable care and diligence? Well, let's say that you walk into a house and you take your buyers, you walk into a house, and there 3 feet up on the basement wall you see a watermark. Would it be reasonable care and diligence on your part to suggest that there might have been water in the property and maybe they should get an inspection, maybe they should press further on the seller's for the seller's disclosure of condition as to the nature of the watermark on the wall? Now that's a pretty exaggerated example, but I can tell you the dozens of times that I've walked into a house and looked at the baseboards in a basement and seen water wicking up, the signs of water wicking up into the woodwork. And that right there is a telltale sign that there has been water in the basement. If the seller hasn't disclosed that on the seller's disclosure statement, well, that's a problem. But it's my job as a buyer's agent to know enough about that property to say, I want you to take a look at that. That is a concern to me because it shows that there's been water in the basement, and maybe we need to find out why. Maybe we need to find out if this has been an historical problem, even though they didn't disclose it on the seller's disclosure form. I talked a little bit mentioned designated agency. 5 Star is a designated agency company, and there's a reason for that. And I'm going to try to explain. I know it's a little complicated, but if I am a designated agent, if I have been designated by Greg Carlson, for example, as an agent for Bob and Susie Smith, buyers, let's say, I am the only one at 5-Star, other than the broker, who is responsible for Bob and Susie Smith's well-being in a transaction. Another agent at 5-Star has no agency relationship with Bob and Susie if I have been named the designated agent for them. Here's where agents get into a problem. They don't get the designated agency form, the buyer's agency contract, which includes a designated agency language. They don't get that signed, or even a disclosure regarding agency relationships signed at the very outset of their relationship with the buyer, for example. Happens mostly with buyers, that's why I'm mentioning that. So they go out and they show them a bunch of houses, and then it's time to write the offer, and they hand them a bunch of papers with the FSRE affiliated business arrangement, seller's disclosure to sign, the purchase agreement, and all this stuff. And in among there is a buyer's agency contract and a disclosure regarding agency relationship. And in there, it indicates that you are a designated agent, and the buyer's agency contract says that you're a designated agent for that buyer. It's one little problem. All the while prior to that, you had not explained or been specific about the nature of your relationship with that buyer. You might have said things like, I'm going to watch out for you, I'm going to take good care of you, I'm going to make sure you get the best deal I can get you, I'm going to walk through all of walk you through the whole process, help you with your lending, all of that stuff. All of those kinds of statements establishes an implied agency relationship. It's not in writing, but if it can be shown that that was the nature of your communication with that buyer, you can establish an implied relationship, agency relationship with that buyer. Here's where you run into a problem in a designated agency office. If you're not designated as that buyer's agent on paper in writing, then through imputed knowledge, a legal concept of imputed knowledge, then all of the 500 plus agents at 5-Star are working for your buyer equally with an equal amount of knowledge about their situation. That's ludicrous. I mean, if you think about it, I'm not going to know about your buyer. I'm not going to know about their financial situation. And yet all of us become liable because one agent has not disclosed the relationship as a designated agent with that buyer and gotten a buyer's agency contract signed, which identifies them as a designated agent for that buyer. That's the reason that we created the Easy Out buyer's agency contract, was to make sure that designated agency was addressed and that an agent was designated as a buyer's agent. Now, whether you choose to use that form or the longer form is up to you. I prefer the longer form, but it's important that from the very outset we disclose to clients, potential clients, what the nature of our relationship is, whether we are acting as a designated agent, and if we are, then we have to have contracts signed to that effect, whether it's a listing contract or a buyer's agency contract. If we don't do that, then we're missing a piece. So if you have somebody, if you let's say you have your brother-in-law's house listed, and you like your brother-in-law, let's throw that in, and somebody walks in that you've never met, and they say, I really like this house, I want to buy it. Do you have to become a dual agent? Are you then automatically a dual agent? And the answer is no. No, you're not. You're still working for your brother-in-law as a seller's agent only, period. And if you make that buyer aware of that and say, Great. I'd love to write an offer up for you. Do the best I can. I'm just as long as you understand that I have a buyer's agency relationship with the seller, or I mean a seller's agency relationship with the seller, and I can't reveal any sort of confidential information about the seller. I'd be happy to write it up for you. Would that be okay? And very often you'll find they'll go, oh yeah, that's perfectly okay, I understand. And then you can disclose to them that you were a seller's agent, that you were a seller's designated agent, and you can continue on and get both sides of the transaction working as a seller's agent. You don't have to go into dual agency. A lot of agents think that simply because you get both sides of the transaction, you're going into dual agency. That's not true. Let's see, what else? Any questions? No questions. I hope that helps clear up the issue of agency a little bit. It's complicated. It's if you run into a question about it, please give Eric or myself a call, and we'll get you the answer. Sometimes it gets gray. You know, if, for example, I have my brother-in-law's house listed and my cousin wants to buy it, how do I represent them equally? Well, I can't. I can become a dual agent and say to both of them, I can't really help you. I can't give you information that would be beneficial to the other party or advantageous to the other party, so I'm going to stay neutral. Frankly, in that situation, I would probably ask them both if I could revert to a transaction coordinator position, because a transaction coordinator doesn't suggest that I have either of their interests at heart. It simply says, I'm a pen and a piece of paper. That's all I am. You tell me what you want me to put on that paper. You negotiate it, and then I'll help you put the transaction together and get it closed. Under dual agency, however, there is the suggestion that you're watching out for their interests, which may or may not be true. I mean, if you're working only for the seller, that's fine. But if you're working for both parties, you can't have a preferential, one party preference over the other one. So I'm getting a look from Dom like he's got a question.
Yeah. Eddie Alexander asked, what was C again? In the
Oh, confidentiality, Eddie. If, for example, I have a house listed at $200,000. I'm the listing agent. I have a house listed at $200,000, and I know very well that the sellers are motivated and they want to move, and they would be more than happy to accept a $185,000 offer. And a buyer walks in and says, what do you think they'll take? Do I have the right to tell them I know they take a $185,000 offer? And the answer is no. If the seller has put that information in writing that you can disclose that, then the answer is yes. But be very careful, because the seller's information is, you have to hold that in confidence. Just as on the flip side, let's say the buyer writes a $175,000 offer, but they say in confidence to you, you know, I'd actually pay full price for that house if I had to. And then you go back and you've got the listing, you actually have to disclose that to the seller. But if you have buyer's agency contract, you can't, because you're held by confidentiality. So disclosure and confidentiality are the two tenets of agency which butt heads when it comes to dual agency. You can't disclose and keep confidential information that each of the parties would otherwise deserve. It limits your agency representation. I hope that helps clear that up.
We have one more question from Nick Fairchild, and then you can reiterate the question as well.
Okay.
He said, can agency start before signing an agency contract?
Can agency start before signing an agency contract? Sort of, yes. The answer is yes, Nick, it can. However, it is implied agency at that point. And as I mentioned, if you are operating under implied agency, you are not operating under designated agency, which means that you have not been designated the agent for that particular party, whether it's a seller or a buyer. That means that all of the agents at 5 Star are representing that buyer or seller that you have just begun to represent as their agent, are representing them as well. It spans the entire brokerage. When you have not identified yourself as the designated agent for that buyer or seller. So the answer is yeah, you can, but it's also dangerous. It's dangerous because it could be perceived that I would know as much about your client or the property or their situation as you know as their agent, and we all know that's just not real. So it's best to get something in writing, whether it's a disclosure regarding agency relationship from the very beginning. That's what the law requires. The law has required that for 25 years. And so if we're not doing that out there, identifying ourselves in a disclosure regarding agency relationship and following it up with a contract that says we are either working for the seller as a designated agent for the seller or as designated agent for a buyer, then we're falling short of getting of the disclosure which the law and ethics requires. Any other questions? Okay. I hope that helps. I know it's confusing, but that's why Eric and I are here, and Kim and Paul and Greg, and we're all here to help you. It's tough to sort out, but that's why we do it. So thanks for joining, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.